So in this lecture we'll be looking at councillors as a follow-on from the week on mayors. And after this lecture you should have developed an understanding of the role of councillors in local authorities across the United Kingdom. You should be aware of who becomes a councillor and their motivations, and also the tension between executive councillors and backbench councillors. So the United Kingdom has 20,160 elected councillors in 2021, and that's from the opencouncildata.co.uk website. Now this obviously varies across nation within the UK based on the different sizes, so what I've done here is provided the information on a councillor per council level and also voters per councillor level. And as we can see, in terms of underrepresentation, Scotland is the least represented nation within the UK, with 3,325 voters per councillor, followed by Northern Ireland with 2,805 voters per councillor, then England with 2,334 voters per councillor, and then in Wales, for every one councillor, there's 1,892 voters. On average, this all is. But what is important to remember for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland is that they all have their own devolved assemblies, whereas England does not. So taking a broad view of this, England is underrepresented on a electoral level, and that is something that probably should be addressed. The table below shows the breakdowns of councillors by party, by nation. So the Conservatives have the most councillors in England at 38%. In Wales, it's Labour. In Scotland, it's the SNP. And in Northern Ireland, it's the DUP. Now, we can see that the number of independent candidates as labelled by the Open Council Data website is much greater in Scotland and Wales than it is in England and Northern Ireland. Now, that's because in Northern Ireland, there's a strong religious or sectarian force binding voters to certain parties. In England, we could explain that away by first past the post, but in Wales, also they use first past the post. It's only recently councils have had the option to not use first past the post. So why is this? Well, it's just that in local authorities in Wales, there's a much greater history of local parties standing for local election, and so we see that kind of playing out in these figures. Just to really hammer home the point of how underrepresented we are as a country when it comes to local government, we can look at this chart. Now this is quite old. The sources are from 2009, 2005, so a lot has happened in the UK, at least on a constitutional level, since then. But the broad point still stands, right? France has 125 people per councillor. They have a lot of councillors, right? Compare that to, say, the UK or England, which in this count here had 2,750 people per councillor. So that's a massive difference, isn't it? But we can also see that, ignoring the outlier perhaps that is France, pretty much most major European countries have more people per councillor, fewer people per councillor than we do. We are underrepresented. Now, an outlier here is Ireland, which has 4,500 people per councillor, and it's no surprise that up until independence, Ireland used the same system as the UK. So the legacies of our system can be seen there. So this is where it gets a bit confusing. So in England, councils vary between single wards, 2-seat wards and 3-seat wards, and there's no requirements for wards within a local authority area to have the same number of seats. So Birmingham, for instance, recently changed from 3-seat wards across the city to a mix of 1- and 2-member wards. In 2- or 3-seat wards, it is the candidate with the highest number of votes, not the party, that wins. Now, in some cases, like in Liverpool, we have 3-member wards, and they are elected in thirds, right? So every year there is an election with a 1 year off, so there's a 4-year cycle. Some areas elect wholly, so that's every 4 years there is an election, and then the council stays that way. 4 years, or by half, which is less common. So that's every 2 years, half of the council is elected. And so what this means is that we can't compare 2019's local election with 2018's, 2018's with 2017's, because we have different councils up for vote. So if you have 1 year a series of unitary authorities up for elections, or metropolitan districts up for election, and then the year after you have county councils, well, you have different demographic breakdowns, right? County councils tend to cover more rural areas, whereas metropolitan districts or unitary authorities tend to cover more urban areas, so you could expect skews in that sense. And so it means that we need to make sure we're comparing like for like. And local authorities across the UK use different electoral systems. So in England, it's first past the post for council, or supplementary vote for mayors, so for kind of individual office holders like police and crime commissioners as well. Whereas in Scotland and Northern Ireland, they use single transferable vote. And recently, Wales, which typically uses first past the post, has given its councils the ability to move to STV if they desire. So, as Wilson and Game note, there was a time when the majority of members on many councils were unelected. Part of the reason was aldermen, right? Aldermen were usually senior and experienced councillors who were appointed by elected councillors to bolster their numbers by up to an additional third of the size of the council. The idea being they should add expertise and continuity to proceedings. Their appointments were for 6 years compared to councillors' then 3-year terms of office. So, aldermen tended to take disproportionate numbers of committee chairs and vice chairs, but they never had to seek the support of or face possible defeat from a fickle electorate. They were undemocratic and they were unaccountable in all senses, but they lived on. Apart from in Northern Ireland and the City of London, they were basically around until the early 1970s. Now, these unelected aldermen would have seemed even more anachronistic had not many councillors themselves never had to face an election. So by the 1960s, 40% or more councillors were winning or retaining their council seats unchallenged. There kind of existed then a sort of double demographic deficit. Up to a quarter of your council did not have to be elected, and large numbers who should have been elected competitively were not. This is one local government deficit that has, since the Local Government Act 1972, been virtually eliminated, with more than 95% of seats in most parts of the country now being contested by more candidates than any time previously. Councillors, both individually and collectively, can claim far greater legitimacy to be speaking as their kind of community's voice of choice. All councillors, even the small minority of self-styled non-partisan or independent councillors, perform what Sir Lawrence Boyle, a key member of the Widdicombe Committee, termed the political function. And that is, all governments, be they central or local, have a twofold function: the service function and the political function. The service function consists of the provisions of those goods and services that for one reason or another are supplied through the public sector. The political function, on the other hand, is the management and reduction of the conflict that arises out of the issues involved in the public provision of goods and services. It embraces such questions as the scope, the scale, and the quality of the public services, and the manner in which their costs should be met. And it should be noted that it is easier, in fact, to remove the service function from local government than to remove the political function. Because the service function, as we know, can always be privatised, but the political function cannot and should not be delegated. If the political function is removed from local government, it ceases to be local government. And that was Boyle speaking in 1986. And this remains pertinent to today. Now, just like MPs, local councillors represent a certain area that we call wards. And these are generally small geographic areas that can vary in size, in fact can vary massively. But they are politicians, right? So these are people who typically stand on a party political label in order to seek votes to be returned to an office. It's important to note that parish councils have a longer history of being non-political in some senses, although often this is more a tradition rather than something that is actually seen through on a day-to-day level, right? So you'll get people who are elected as independents but will act as Labour or Conservative representatives. There is nowadays, unlike in the past, at least some guidance in most councils, but these are of limited assistance, partly because they are pretty bland, partly because they are aimed at all councillors, as in regardless of whether they're executive or backbench, and this means that the guidance can only ever paint an incomplete picture of what councillors are expected to do, because their roles change dramatically based on whether they have executive power or whether they don't. Now, it's not simply the case that councillors make policy and officers implement and administer it. Firstly, it would be impractical for a small group of unpaid, or at least a group of people who only receive an allowance, and amateur councillors to make policy for such a wide range of areas, at least without some consultation with officers who are full-time and often highly experienced. Similarly, of course, councillors will be concerned with the implementation of policy, since this directly feeds into whether they will be rewarded or punished at the ballot box. So the relationship between officers and councillors is more complex. Most councillors would see their role as ensuring representation and accountability and undertaking policy formulation, performance monitoring, as well as community leadership, even if the extent to which each councillor does this varies. And so this shows that there is a role within City Hall, and there is also a role outside of the council chamber for councillors. And in many ways there's parallels to being an MP here. However, with the introduction of executive-based policy making, councils have to either be part of their council's executive or not. As a result, some of the roles and responsibilities continue to be shared by all councillors, and then some are only exercised by the executive councillors. In the same way that a backbench MP doesn't have any responsibility for administering policy, creating policy, a non-executive councillor, a backbench councillor, if you will, would only have a say, or would only have influence or power over, or the ability to undertake non-executive functions. So, following New Labour's reforms, for the first time, not all councillors are able to claim they have input in all the roles of a councillor. And to explain this, we shall examine each of these in turn. So we can also look at what councillors think their roles and responsibilities are. This is the National Census of Local Authority Councillors, 2013. Councillors from different regions responded similarly to this question. The importance placed on holding surgeries in particular seemed to vary between different types of authorities. For example, councillors in shire counties and shire districts were less likely to report this than those in London boroughs and metropolitan districts. So the difference is, in shire counties it was 7.2%, and in shire districts it was 9%, whilst in London boroughs it was 21%, and in metropolitan districts it was 20.4%, who said that holding surgeries was important. No under 25s prioritised holding surgeries above the other things councillors do, relative to 14.4% of those aged 65 to 69. So the proportions of councillors who felt that dealing with complaints was the most important thing for them to do was seen to increase with age as well. And this might reflect the different motivations that people have to going into local politics. It might also reflect the type of different areas that people of different ages are likely to become representatives for, i.e. younger people are more likely to become representatives for more urban areas, and there might be something in that. So in terms of the role and responsibilities of councillors, we'll start with representation, right? So each councillor is elected by and is accountable to the residents of a defined geographic area known as an electoral ward or division. Constituency is primarily a parliamentary term. With the exceptional scale of UK local government, these electorates can be dauntingly large from the viewpoints of councillors trying to represent them. This ties into what we were talking about earlier, about the scale or the number of elected councillors per person. We have proportionately fewer and much larger local authorities than almost any other Western country, and, as noted, they're steadily becoming fewer and larger. As a result of this, with the single exception of the Republic of Ireland, most centrally administered governmental systems in Western Europe, we citizens have fewer councillors to represent us. As with other aspects of the job, councillors themselves decide how much energy they put in to the representation of their electorate. They do not have to hold surgeries or advice bureaus, they don't have to publicise their availability, they don't have to answer complaint queries or deal with people's opinions. Most councillors, however, do choose to do these things, and much more besides, in which case they are likely to find themselves acting in several distinct representational sub-roles. In addition to caseworker and individual problem solver, they also have to be listeners, advocates, handholders, facilitators, and empowerers. The 2007 Local Government and Public Involvement in Health Act added a dimension to the representative role in the form of the councillor call for action. If a local government or crime and disorder issue of concern arises in a councillor's ward and there appears to be no satisfactory means of resolution, they can bring the issue to the Council's Petitions Committee and ultimately to an Overview and Scrutiny Committee for review, and this potentially gives them a lot of influence and agenda-setting powers in their community. Councillors also, to some extent, have a policy-making role. Traditionally, all councillors worked in committees and subcommittees developing policies, assisted by their officers, but holding the constitutional responsibility for giving strategic direction to the authority and for determining its policy priorities. All councils organised their work through these committees, and all councillors would find themselves appointed to at least one or two of these. So they could all regard themselves as contributing to policy making, at least in some areas of their council's responsibilities, and they were all collectively responsible for policy as a whole. All councillors were potentially liable to be individually surcharged for supporting unlawful local expenditure, even when they themselves had received no personal benefit from the decision. This happened in the 1980s in Liverpool, with Labour councillors being surcharged for their decision to set an illegal budget. As previously mentioned, the Local Government Act 2000 introduced the executive non-executive split in councillors' roles, and from then on, a small minority of councillors on most authorities became executive members, usually with responsibility for a specific service portfolio as part of a cabinet. Even though the policy areas may look similar or may have the same names as the committee they replaced, being a cabinet member is very different from being a committee chair. The key point of the executive non-executive split is to clarify publicly who is responsible for making particular policy decisions, and that is what executive members do. They make decisions and they take public responsibility for them through the process of scrutiny by non-executive members. Some decisions will be taken collectively by the Cabinet as a whole, but others will be taken individually, in a way that was not legally permitted for even the most powerful committee chair to do so in the old system. However, in reality as well, non-executive members still play a policy role. As ward representatives, these councillors see and hear how the policies of the council and other bodies affect their own electorates, their own electors and localities. If a policy is not working as intended, or if service delivery is unsatisfactory, they are likely to be the first to receive complaints, and repeated complaints should feed into the process of policy evaluation and review. As members of full council, which has a much changed and potentially enhanced role under executive government, the executive leads the preparation of the local authority's policy and budget, but the policy and budget frameworks have to be agreed formally by the full council, as do many policy plans and strategies that authorities are required to produce. Executive members take in-year decisions on resources and priorities to implement, agreed policies, but decisions not in accordance with the policy or budget framework, or that are not constitutionally the executive's responsibility, must go to full council. The council also receives and debates all overview and scrutiny reports, which brings us to councillors' third main role, that of scrutineer. For Wilson and Game, the overview and scrutiny functions are the key non-executive role in the government's modernisation of councils' political management, and its effective operation is arguably the real determinant of whether the executive-non-executive split is judged to be a success. Wilson and Game argued that this scrutiny role is a powerful set of arrangements for councillors to influence not only council policy, but also the policies of a range of public and private agencies. In short, it has introduced into local government something that clearly ought to have existed previously, but almost never did: scrutiny. However, they argue that the bad news is that the aspect of the new arrangements sees councils and the non-executive councillors most effective because they found it hardest to get working productively. Councils decide for themselves how to organise their overview and scrutiny function, though some requirements are non-negotiable. All overview and scrutiny committees must reflect the political balance of the council, must meet in public, must review all matters that are the responsibility of the executive, no member of which can be member of a scrutiny committee. Beyond that, the vary of practice is considerable. The average council has four 11-member overview and scrutiny committees, but a fifth have only one, and the range extends up to 11. And I think what we've seen in Liverpool and some other councils is that there probably needs to be more rigorous rules around oversight and scrutiny. And this involves some element of increased consistency about what is acceptable, and a role for greater public oversight as well, or public involvement. There is also a process for external scrutiny, where local government committees look at issues which lie outside the council's responsibility. For example, in England, specific powers exist to scrutinise health bodies, crime and disorder partnerships, and the police and crime commissioners. Combined authorities are also required to establish overview and scrutiny committees. Now, in Northern Ireland, there were provisions introduced in 2014 for new local authorities which took up their powers on the 1st of April 2015. These new authorities can choose between a committee system and a cabinet-based system. If they choose the latter, the cabinet-based system, they must appoint at least one overview and scrutiny committee. Legislation in England, Wales and Northern Ireland have much in common regarding the powers and functions of overview and scrutiny committees, including any member of an overview and scrutiny committee has the right to refer a relevant matter to the committee. In England, this provision does not apply to matters concerned with planning and licensing, or to any matter which is vexatious, discriminatory, or not reasonable to be included in the agenda. Overview and scrutiny committees may hold inquiries and produce reports. Committees may require executive members and officers of the authority to appear before them. Individuals from outside the council can be invited, but not compelled to attend. Overview and scrutiny reports must receive a response from the council executive within 2 months. Overview and scrutiny committees cannot oblige either the executive, the council, or external bodies to act upon their findings, and each authority must appoint at least one scrutiny officer. The scrutiny officer does not have to be a dedicated post and can be combined with other responsibilities. There are some differences, however. In Wales, the political balance of the local authority must be taken into account when allocating the chairs of scrutiny, oversight and scrutiny committees. This does not apply in England or Northern Ireland. The Centre for Public Scrutiny conducted a survey in 2014 which found that in 65% of respondent councils, all of the scrutiny chair positions were held by the majority party, which ain't great. In the 2002 Local Government Act provided for a system of overview and scrutiny which was directed solely at the internal functions of the council. However, many committees set up under the new arrangements covered policy areas spanning both the council and other public bodies, and thus began to take an interest in matters outside the council's direct control. This form of overview and scrutiny has become known as external scrutiny, and external scrutiny demands a different dynamic from scrutiny of council functions, since councillors have no direct influence over external bodies. Hence, external scrutiny relies on good relationships and joint working with external bodies to allow the councillors to influence other organisations' behaviour. Overview and scrutiny committees have powers over specific bodies. There's provision for health scrutiny of health bodies and authorities, provision for a crime and disorder committee, which are mandatory committees for all local authorities, which have to scrutinise the delivery of crime and disorder strategies. And in England, the Secretary of State can make regulations obliging the provision of information to an Overview and Scrutiny Committee by a relevant partner authority. Now, in terms of the effectiveness of Overview and Scrutiny Committees, the Centre for Public Scrutiny argued in 2015 that the main blockages to effective scrutiny might arise equally with senior officers or members, and that obstacles tended to be a question of culture rather than overtly political behaviour. So, structural factors of oversight might be less important than working to change the culture of authorities. In 2008, the Labour government published a white paper entitled Communities in Control. The then Secretary of State, Hazel Blears, announced the government's ambition to raise the profile of Overview and Scrutiny Committees, making them analogous to select committee systems at national level. However, the extent to which this is achieved is questionable. For Wilson and Game, 3 conditions must be met to make Overview and Scrutiny work properly. They argue for new training or skills to allow councillors to assess and probe, and have the ability to work collaboratively to draw out evidence and views from witnesses and data. The ability to work across party lines is also important, as is a dedicated officer and resources to support scrutiny and oversight. The Centre for Public Scrutiny argues that large political majorities and strong leaders may inhibit scrutiny committees' independence, and there's some evidence that scrutiny is more valued and effective in councils under no overall control. They say we are concerned at the finding that 30% of respondents said the scrutiny chairs are appointed by the leader, which must call into question their perceived independence at the very least, although encouraged that slightly more said they are chosen by non-executive members by a cross-party basis. A worrying minority of council scrutiny functions do not appear to be fulfilling their challenge role effectively, including failing to triangulate what they are told by officers and the executive against the experiences of service users or external benchmarking data. When it comes to combined authorities in England are required to establish Overview and Scrutiny Committees by the Cities and Local Government Devolution Act 2016. Further provisions are made by the Combined Authorities Order 2017. A majority of the members of a committee must be councillors from member councils of the combined authority. Members may be co-opted from outside member councils, but they will have no vote. The quorum is 2/3 of the total membership. The committee will have the power to compel members and officers of the combined authority to attend meetings and answer questions, including the elected mayor, if there is one. The committee's chair cannot come from the same political party as the mayor, or as the largest party on the combined authority if the mayor is independent. The committee must reflect the political balance of the combined authority's member authorities as far as possible. The combined authority must appoint 1 scrutiny officer. The Overview and Scrutiny Committee will be able to call in a decision of the mayor or executive for 14 days. The mayor or executive must respond to any recommendation following a call in within 10 days of the call in taking effect, and members of the combined authority cannot sit on the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. However, the effectiveness of scrutiny and the ability of councillors to undertake these roles effectively depends on it being well funded. However, in 2014, the Combined Public Scrutiny Annual Survey found the average number of full-time equivalent officer posts for 2014 to 15 was 1.87, well above the predicted average. However, the dedicated average scrutiny budget did not follow this trend. For the 8th year in a row, the budget has declined, and the average budget in 2014 to 15 for scrutiny was £3,277, down £200 from 2013 to 14. Similarly, effective scrutiny and oversight involves non-executive councillors challenging not just the executive, but also their own party identities and loyalties. Majority party members have to work with colleagues from other parties in scrutinising and perhaps criticising publicly the performance of senior executive members from their own party. So too do members of parliamentary select committees, but Leach and Coper suggest that councils, or councillors, in several respects have it significantly harder. First of all, the double role requires councillors to hold both executive members to account and, at the same time, in policy development mode, to work with executive councillors. Secondly, there's no real tradition in local government in terms of questioning and cross-questioning executive councillors effectively. Thirdly, party group discipline can be even more entrenched and inflexible in local government than in Parliament. Fourth, local government's unified officer structure is expected to support both the executive and scrutiny functions, which creates an almost inevitable role conflict. Councillors are also expected to act as community leaders, despite the fact that councillors themselves have to share power and act within governance networks, rather than as having service provider dominance in key areas. As service provision has become more fragmented and councils work in partnership with other organisations in a network of community governance, councillors stand out increasingly as the only democratically elected parts of an increasingly complex system. They're also the ones in closest touch with the electorate and service users. They are the ones likely to have to field inquiries about non-council services, such as health authorities, housing associations, primary care groups, highways agencies. If their particular local community is going to have leadership over and above mere representation, where else is it going to come from? Wilson and Game argue that while the executive-non-executive split has created some differentiation between the types of councillors, it is important not to overestimate it. The roles of all councillors are summed up in the difference in roles in this table taken from the LGA in 2000. In terms of the councillors' potential roles, numerically most are still shared by executive and non-executive members alike. Moreover, given the interdependence of policy and implementation, and the policy developmental role of scrutiny, even the big areas, so cabinet overview and scrutiny, should not be seen as entirely separate worlds. For either to function to its optimal effect, collaboration is required. So, like MPs, a councillor could get away with doing an absolute minimum, attending the occasional council meeting, the occasional scrutiny committee, and avoiding, as far as possible, all contact with voters. However, according to the literature, there are few of these councillors, and the more frequent behavioural pattern adopted is a maximalist and proactive one. Remuneration. In terms of rewarding councillors, local authorities decide their own allowances. The Local Government Act 2000 requires all principal councils to establish and maintain an independent remuneration panel of at least 3 persons to advise the council on its schemes of allowances, the amount to be paid, the pensionability of executive members' allowances. All councils must pay a basic allowance, a flat rate allowance paid to all councillors in recognition of their time commitments in attending council and party group meetings, meeting officers and constituents, and their incidental costs, use of home, private telephone, etc. There are 3 elements of basic allowances. The first is the estimation of hours required to perform the tasks expected of a non-executive member of the council. Decisions on the appropriate hour and daily rate to be paid, e.g. the median male full-time earnings, often adjusted to compare with local pay rates. And then a decision on the size of the public service discount. In recognition of the principle council work as a voluntary service, some proportion of hours should not be remunerated, usually between 20 and 50%. The table shows English councils with the highest and lowest rate of basic allowance. In 2014 to 15 by authority type, taken from the Taxpayers Alliance Councillors Allowance Report, and there's massive variation. However, with executive councillors have come, on a modest scale at least, UK local government's first executive salaries, or strictly speaking, pensionable remuneration, to emphasise that pensionable allowances do not make executive members employees of their local authority. So Joe Anderson was paid £79,500, which was 7.8 times more than a councillor's basic allowance. Allowances might be paid, such as a special responsibility allowance for executive members and other councillors with significant additional responsibilities, including at least 1 minority party member. In Liverpool, the highest special responsibility allowance was £28,863.90 to Anne O'Byrne, until recently the Deputy Mayor. A carer's allowance payable to councillors who incur expenditure for care of dependent relatives or children while undertaking approved council duties. In Liverpool, the highest carer's allowance paid was £161 and only 1 person took it. A travel and subsistence allowance payable if felt not to be adequately covered in basic allowance. In 2017 to 18, the highest travel claim was from Richard Kemp, leader of the Liberal Democrats, who claimed £988.75. The next highest was from Steve Radford at £67.50. And in a meetings allowance, payable to non-elected members co-opted or appointed to certain council committees and panels, for example, scrutiny committees, school exclusion appeal panels, and so on. Now, what's important about this is that this varies from authority to authority, and there's often very little in the way of transparency, right? There's no central database that records all this information, even though, in my opinion, there should be. And it's definitely not tied to any element of performance indicator. So the Scottish system is different. The revised system, introduced following the first single transferable vote elections in 2007, is more centralised than England's, and no doubt partially in acknowledgement of the apparent workload disparities due to large awards and single transferable vote, more generous. In 2017, the basic rate was just shy of 17 grand. There are no directly elected mayors in Scotland, and a council leader's salary is in one of 4 bands, ranging in accordance to local authority population. With few councils having opted for executive-based local government, all councillors with additional responsibilities are grouped together for remuneration purposes as senior councillors, and a limited number are paid an enhanced salary, again banded according to local authority size. The pay is not specified, but the Scottish Government set a maximum amount of 75% of the pay of the leader of the council and a minimum amount, the basic pay of a councillor, that a senior councillor can be paid. The government hoped this more discretionary allowance system would address some of the existing disincentives to serving in local politics, whilst recognising that people do not enter public service to make their fortune. So why enter local government service as a councillor? The National Census of Local Authority Councillors 2013 typically shows that overwhelmingly the reason is to serve their community, to change things, and for political beliefs. Most councillors, 90%, had sought their role in order to serve the community, although there's an element of, they would say that, wouldn't they, right? The other most popular reason was to change things at nearly 60%, political beliefs at 54.4%, and being asked to 27.4%, and to resolve an issue at 14.6%. And this is similar to proportions identified in 2006, 2008 and 2010. Male and female councillors responded to this question similarly, although councillors from non-white backgrounds were more likely to have taken on this role in order to serve the community, to change things or to resolve an issue than their white counterparts. They were less likely to have been asked. The pattern of responses was similar to those obtained in 2008 and 2010. There were few differences in councillors' responses when analysed by region or authority type, although a greater proportion of those from metropolitan districts and from the North East tended to have become councillors because of their political beliefs compared to the national average. Green Party councillors has been motivated to take on this role because of their political beliefs, that's 97.2%, and to change things for the better, to a greater extent than other parties. Figures for other parties ranged from 12.4% for independents or residents associations when it came to joining for political beliefs, to 75.5% for Labour Party councillors. And when it comes to change things, the Conservatives were on 50% and Labour to 70%. So there are variations between different party candidates on why they stand for council. The pay of Metro mayors is set by an independent panel, which then needs to be approved by council leaders. In the case of Manchester, the panel decided that, unlike other regions, the mayor will also take on the responsibility of police commissioner and the chair of the fire authority, who currently receives a combined payment of £130,000. And the extent of the Greater Manchester Mayor's powers over transport, policing, fire, economic development, waste and health were significant and distinctive compared to other parts of the country. The allowance will not be pensionable or index linked and will be reviewed again in 2020, or was reviewed again in 2020. So we can look at the National Census of Local Authority Councillors 2013 to see the demographics of councillors, although this might have changed, but predominantly male, predominantly older, right? So nearly half of councillors are over the age, in fact, over half of councillors are over the age of 60. Right, and that's partly because it's not a fully paid job. Younger people probably too busy with careers, so it's something you can do when you're retired to some extent. Does gender distortion matter? Well, inevitably, yes. So there's evidence to show that councils with more women are more likely to have different policy priorities than those that are predominantly men, and their process of making decisions is different, is more inclusive. Women are also more likely to use council services and engage with the council than men, and so having more women on the council should, in theory, bring more voices to the table from actual service users. A similar argument applies to ethnic minority councillors as well, right? Bringing different priorities to the table. So the vast majority of councillors were white, 96% in 2013, and very few were from other ethnic backgrounds. These figures are similar to those found in previous local authority censuses. So in 2010, 96.3% of councillors were white, and in 2008 that was 96.6%. So it's very slowly getting less white, and this will obviously vary from council to council. All of the councillors from Green Party and UKIP were white. Of the main political parties, the Conservatives had the smallest proportion of representatives who were from non-white backgrounds, followed by the Liberal Democrats. The Labour Party had the highest proportion. And a greater proportion of councillors in London boroughs were from ethnic minority backgrounds. That's 15.7% compared to 4% nationally. Whereas councillors in the North East and the South West were most likely to be white, 100% and 99.2% respectively, than any other region. But again, this is this was about 8 years ago, isn't it, 2013.